Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Basic Income Workshop Series powered by FRIBIS, the Freiburg Institute for Basic Income Studies. Today's workshop is a consequence of the initiative of the philosopher and political economist Dr. Otto Lehto from the NYU, who was just recently a visiting scholar at the GWP and FRIBIS here in Freiburg. He is going to speak about permissionless innovation, freedom, and basic income. After his input, which will be approximately 45 minutes long, we will have a discussion with two prominent discussants from the basic income research field, namely Professor Karl Widerquist, who is a professor of philosophy at Qatar University and who was also a visiting professor in Freiburg. And secondly, Professor Bernhard Neumerker, who is the director of the GWP and FRIBIS. Thanks to you both for your contribution. And I also want to invite the YouTube audience and the other people here in the Zoom room to participate in the discussion. So put your comments or questions in the live chat or raise your hands here in Zoom. Our plan is to finish around 5:30, and in order not to lose time, we jump directly into your input, Otto. We are looking forward to it. It's a pleasure having you, and thanks for your initiative.
Well, thank you very much. Shall I start?
Yes,
Good.
Please.
Well, thank you all for coming here. Thanks for the commentators also, who I'm looking forward to hearing from, but most importantly, everybody here who's joined us today. Now, this is not my first talk for FRIBIS, but this is my first talk in which I try to really articulate my current main research agenda, which comes out of and continues to produce things out of my thesis work, my PhD thesis work, which I just finished last winter, and which will come out first as an e-thesis form, which will be freely available for everybody to have a look at, and also hopefully as a book. So if there's any book publishers in the audience today, do be in touch. I'm trying to turn this into a book as well. So the topic of my thesis and also of my presentation today is my way of providing a new, or not so new, perhaps kind of like a reimagined theory of freedom as it relates to basic income. Now, the type of freedom that I will talk about today can be called by many names, but the one that I've come to prefer is that of evolutionary liberalism. It is an evolutionary liberal argument for a kind of basic income, which comes out of a long tradition of liberal thinking about social and economic evolution. Now, what is social and economic evolution? I will get to that in a moment, but first I think it's good to clarify a few of the key terms of my title. So my title is Permissionless Innovation, Freedom and Basic Income. Now, freedom, I will come to in a moment. Let's start with innovation. Of course, innovation can mean many things. Narrowly speaking, it is often used in terms of either technological innovation or business innovation, but it really extends much beyond that. And I think innovation in the evolutionary sense is a very broad term. It refers to all productions of novelty, all productions of at least socially relevant novelty, which have an impact in how people live, what kind of opportunities and resources are available to people. So innovation is the production of new things, novelties, and their selection by the social process, the different selection processes in the society, and their diffusion through the society with various consequences, good, bad, neutral. So innovations can be anything from the production of new goods and services to the invention of new technologies to anything like the creation of a new idea or a new habit or a new lifestyle or a modification of a previous habit, idea, lifestyle in a new way in which the novelty exists in the modification of old forms of old things and old ideas. And in fact, most innovation is of this order. It doesn't come out of nothing. It's not the creation ex nihilo, but it's the modification of things that are out there, and that can be turned into something new, something interesting, sometimes something destructive, something horrible, but the creation of new things. And freedom therefore becomes understood as a system in which people exercise their right to be free from established patterns of expectations and habits and ideas and norms to produce something new. That is to say, to produce innovations. Therefore, the link that I propose here between freedom and innovation is that freedom inherently involves the production, the capacity to produce, consume, select, and diffuse different innovations. That's one of the main functions of it, indeed, if we think about the consequences of it. So basic income has been tied in the literature to freedom in different ways. The most famous one is Van Parijs's conception of real freedom for all. Real freedom for all has a normative justification in Van Parijs's case from a kind of a contractarian Rawlsian point of view. It involves granting people the real freedom to do what they want to do, to pursue the kinds of ends and lifestyles that they wish to pursue. Now, what I will do here is take that formal definition of freedom and say that it is very useful in this innovation debate without tying myself to those normative foundations. And indeed, I will provide alternative normative foundations. Similarly, with the other relevant and very prominent conceptions of freedom in the UBI debate, namely Karl Widerquist, a gentleman who many of you have heard of and who's actually here today, his conception of freedom as the power to say no. Well, what is freedom as the power to say no? He also calls it effective controlled self-ownership freedom in some contexts. Freedom as the power to say no is the freedom to have right to a kind of status freedom in which people have effective control over a certain level of access to basic resources and opportunities for survival. And basic income is a tool of achieving such a status. Now, again, the normative justifications for Karl Widerquist are in the supposed normative requirement that nobody should be denied access to a certain level of access to basic resources and basic opportunities for survival. In this sense, both Van Parijs and Widerquist offer theories of justice or fairness or equity, which justify a certain theory of freedom. But my theory of freedom as innovation provides an alternative normative foundation, as I said. So in this debate, we might distinguish between those theories of freedom which see freedom as being either inherently justifiable because freedom is just a primary good, or freedom as sort of stemming out of some either social contract justifications, as in Buchanan's work and Rawls's work and Van Parijs's work, or some other sort of theories of justice which seek to ground freedom as being sort of one of the requirements of justice, without so much regard for the consequences or the uses of that freedom. However, other conceptions of freedom, such as the one that I favor in this talk anyway, is one that looks at the consequences of freedom, that looks at freedom as a system of production, freedom as a system in which certain things are achieved and certain things are made possible. Therefore, freedom is justified not on the basis of achieving any level of justice or fairness or equity, but in terms of the production capacity that freedom entails. Therefore, my theory belongs to this consequentialist, even utilitarian sort of tradition of thinking about freedom. And in this tradition, I would count not just, of course, myself, but also many others, including, in particular, this sort of what I have called evolutionary liberal tradition, which really goes back to David Hume, Adam Smith, and in our own times to people like Hayek, Schumpeter, and many others. Indeed, I would count also people in philosophy like Peter Singer as being as doing something similar in their conceptions of freedom. But today I will focus therefore on this notion of innovation, or what I have called permissionless innovation in this context. So if freedom is about the production of new things, if freedom is about the production of good things, and some of those new things will be good, some of those new things will be bad, how do we know how much freedom we should give to people? The question is, how will people use their freedom? Will freedom be used to produce bad things or to produce good things? In other words, will the innovations that happen and get selected be for the benefit of society, benefit of the individuals in the society, or will they be to the detriment of those people? Of course, it will be both. If you have freedom, there will be a divergence of actions, a divergence of patterns of behavior, a divergence of lifestyles, all of which will lead to divergent outcomes. Therefore, freedom cannot be used as a mechanism for producing any particular type of outcome consistently. It will always produce unpredictable and uncontrollable outcomes, as indeed social evolution does, even without a strong protection of freedom. Even totalitarian regimes, in fact, tend to deviate from their original plans and tend to go astray. So the type of evolutionary thinking that I think is relevant here is not just thinking about evolution in terms of the evolution of institutions, but thinking evolution in the broad sense of the changes in the patterns of lifestyles, habits, economic structures of the social order. And basic income and other such institutional reforms of the rule structure, of the basic institutional structure, can be analyzed in their capacity to either help or hinder different types of processes of evolution. And innovation is the means by which new things are brought into being. Innovation happens not just in human societies, but also in nature. Indeed, the whole Darwinian process is based on the production of innovations. The innovations that happen in nature are things like mutations and genetic recombinations, which produce new types of species in the end, new types of variation. Variation is the key part of the production of innovations in nature. And indeed, the similar processes also occur in human society, where you have the production of new types of mutations, new types of variations. Some of those mutations are consciously created. Some of those mutations simply happen by accident, by fortuitous circumstances, or unhappy circumstances, in which new things come into being that nobody really predicted. And in fact, I think most innovation in social life is of that latter nature, not of conscious design, but of, in the words of Adam Ferguson, the result of human action, but not of human design. So permissionless innovation is innovation without having to ask anybody for permission. Permissionless here simply means without requiring permission to do things. So freedom as permissionless innovation in this sense is the freedom to produce new types of things, to select them for one's own life, learning from others, copying others, buying things from others, trading with others, to facilitate the spread of new types of innovations. And I think some kind of basic income could be justified from this point of view. But I think what comes out of this is not just kind of a justification for basic income, but a justification for a more broader institutional approach in which basic income can be one part, but not necessarily even the most important part. And basic income that does not produce help society produce innovations that are good for people, in particular good for poor people, will not be selected or will not be favored. Of course, a comprehensive ethical analysis will also have to take into account other moral theories, other theories of justice that think about, for example, the fairness of initial resource distribution or the fairness of social equalities and inequalities. These are not the concerns of the evolutionary approach. So it all depends on what normative principles we favor. As a thoroughgoing consequentialist with some kind of contractarian sympathies as well, I think that the only things we should care about are the expected consequences of our actions. But I will not attempt to justify this strong claim here. I think even people who think that justice is not exhausted by consequentialist considerations should care about the innovation potential of basic income and of the other institutional rules we have, because it is those consequences that matter for human flourishing, and human flourishing is something that most people should care about. So all these prominent theories of freedom in the basic income debate, like Van Parijs's, Widerquist, even Milton Friedman's, Philip van Petit's Republican theory of freedom as well, despite their differences, they dictate some kind of an institutional structure of rights that gives people the right, both formal and substantive, to some material freedom, some real freedom to do what they want to do. So in this sense, freedom must mean, among other things, the freedom to experiment with new things, to deviate from the expectations and demands of other people, and to innovate without having to ask anybody for permission. Freedom, in other words, is intimately tied to permissionless innovation. And today I will interrogate a little bit the relationship between this notion of freedom and the theories of innovation in evolutionary thinking, especially evolutionary political economy, both in its traditional liberal manifestations and in its contemporary manifestations. And I argue that basic income under some implementations could be seen as a tool of permissionless innovation, which grants people, especially poor people, the right to innovate without having to ask anybody for permission. It therefore empowers poor people to exercise their freedom in ways that will hopefully in the long run be beneficial for society, due to its ability to change the social structure towards the consumption and production of better innovations as opposed to worse innovations. So in this consequentialist theory of evolutionary welfare enhancement justifies the right to basic income and the right to permissionless innovation, not in terms of justice or equity, but in terms of consequentialism, that is the evolutionary consequentialism of society. So I think that innovation, even kind of radically innovative society, is justified by the consequentialist considerations and gives a compelling justification for a liberal implementation of basic income in which innovation is encouraged in order to more effectively solve the problems of the poor. And one crucial thing about this theory then is that socioeconomic innovation in this technical, broad evolutionary sense extends beyond the economic realm of goods and services and technologies, although those are very, very important indeed, but also to the cultural realm of habits, ideas, and social norms. And I will get to that in a moment. I think that this kind of consequentialist conception challenges several prominent justifications, models, and implementations of basic income, especially those that see basic income more as a means of either achieving justice or of kind of like providing some kind of stability to a social order. It more kind of it promises to destabilize society, because if we see innovations as good, we therefore also see that destabilizing existing structures can be good, and that even radical transformations of the social order can be desirable. Although not, of course, just any transformation, any radical change in the social order, because most transformations will be harmful to people. What we want to do is have a system of radical transformations that is of social evolution that produces effectively, robustly, sustainably innovations in all areas of life, that is moving from worse solutions to better solutions, from worse technologies to better technologies, from worse lifestyles and ideas to better lifestyles and ideas, but without fully being able to be in control of such a society. And so I think it's obvious from kind of looking at the sociological economic literature today that both cultural and economic evolution are some of the most important features of the modern world. We have experienced unparalleled changes in our habits, lifestyles, technologies, labor markets, business models, institutions, and more. And these changes have been kinds of innovations. So I think that philosophy and political economy must tackle this normative dimension of evolution head on, since most things, or at least many things that people care about and should care about, depend upon the well-managed and rule-guided evolutionary processes in which new innovations are produced and consumed. The corollary hypothesis here is that institutional interventions should be at least partially judged by their ability to increase the innovation capacity, or what is sometimes called in the literature adaptive capacity of our institutional structures. That is the capacity to make people more adaptive to circumstances and to be more innovative in their actions and habits. Because I think solving complex and ever-changing problems, whether it's things like climate change, problems of poverty, problems of kind of moral failure as well, they all include, I think, the persistence of bad ideas, bad habits, or ineffective technologies and solutions, which are calling out for improvements, calling out for innovative improvements. So we need learning, we need evolutionary learning, which helps to solve those problems in a more effective way through innovations. And this is what might be called adaptive welfare state governance or innovative welfare state governance should be about. This doesn't mean that our institutional design should simply only focus on that, but I think it's a very important part of it. Nor does it mean that we are beholden to simply sort of like blindly seeing what happens, but we can also exercise conscious control over some of the general guidelines and general goals of social evolution, and we can set up certain general goals for society and use these processes of innovation to get closer to those goals. But even then, we have to recognize that we are never in full control of the social order, and even our current ideas and habits of what a good society looks like might be out of, they might themselves be in need of change and improvement. So we should not wed ourselves to our existing ideas fully either. A good example of this, I think, is that in recent years, as we know, we have seen that society has been brought to its knees by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this crisis, I think, highlights the power of evolutionary forces to create powerful innovations on two levels and in two ways. On the one hand, evolutionary forces have created the viruses themselves, which have wreaked such havoc on a global scale and caused the catastrophic risk of serious harm. At the same time, the crisis has highlighted the importance of adaptive governance, that is to have the increasing capacity to generate innovations, to generate adaptive and creative responses to emerging problems. The vaccines are a good example of a type of innovation that has been quite rapidly produced and would not have been possible in a social environment that gave less importance to the production of innovations. So in other words, it's been an arms race between the innovations arising out of the viral realm and innovations arising out of the technological and scientific realm, and also institutional governance realm, coming up with different ways of lockdowns, different ways of regulations, and trying to find the solutions to problems there. So I think in all of these ways, it's clear that evolutionary learning is a necessary part and a very important part of evolutionary learning. And if we really take this seriously, we could also say that it has to be not just reactive, but proactive. That is, we need to be thinking far ahead. What if instead of waiting for viruses to emerge, we set in motion processes that make it possible for us to better understand viruses, to increase our scientific knowledge of them, also empower ordinary people to be more scientifically literate, empower ordinary people to have the resources that if a crisis comes, they can survive and have the capacity to respond to crises in a more effective way. And indeed to develop technologies that give us immunity to viruses, that is to develop proactive vaccines maybe to any viral pandemic, in which case it will cease to be a social problem. That would be a grand innovation indeed. Not something that I think will happen anytime soon, but who knows? We've made incredible progress in these areas in recent years. So adaptive governance is very, very important. And if poor people would get to choose which one they would rather want, a technological solution that eradicates the threat of pandemics, or a slight increase, for example, in their, I don't know, the level of their welfare services, then maybe they would choose the former over the latter. But if so, what do we get from this? Well, I think it's clear that that it would be good if human beings and human societies could take advantage of these kind of evolutionary capacities for generating innovations, generating adaptations, in order to better solve problems. So we could do this by kind of imitating and replicating the creative power of viruses and animals and plants in the service of consciously designed human ends. Because evolution is a versatile general purpose problem-solving mechanism. I repeat that it is a versatile general purpose problem-solving mechanism that can be harnessed to serve various human ends. And if we have a society that is generally very innovative, that is generally very versatile in solving problems, whatever the nature of those problems, then we have, in a way, a good society that is very adaptive and very flexible and responsive to new challenges. So I think in this context, we should also think about basic income. So innovation is important because it allows us to develop better solutions to problems. And we have already seen, for example, that outside of Darwinian selection, it has also proved vital, for example, in development of artificial intelligence solutions through machine learning, reinforcement learning, and so on. And I think we should come to grips with the fact that we need to also apply these principles in different ways to the realm of political economy, of our social institutions, and of our normative ethics. Even so, one of the key insights of this evolutionary approach is that we can never truly, fully control it. It remains an unknown and uncontrollable factor that we cannot ever fully tame. But I think, yes, I think poor and disadvantaged people in particular, they stand to benefit a lot from innovations. In the available resources they have, the material realm around them, the ideas, the habits, the customs, and the goods and services around them. And indeed, if this is so, oftentimes it's better to invest more resources in the discovery of new things, that is the exploration of what is possible, rather than the improved access to or improved use of what already exists and what already is out there. So in other words, there's a exploration exploitation trade-off. In the technical terminology, exploration is the search for new solutions, new innovations, and exploitation is the capacity to take advantage of existing solutions and innovations. And I think basic income is curious because it is situated between those two processes. That is, on some ways, basic income might make it easier for people to exploit existing resources in a better way. That is to say, basic income might make it more easy for some people who are resource poor to take advantage of, for example, what markets and the civil society can have to offer for them, because they have more freedom, the power to say no in Widerquist's sense, and the real freedom to do what they want to do in Van Parijs' sense, and therefore to have better access to innovations that they themselves feel that they need or should have. And I think this is very important. But it's not just that. It's not just having kind of passive consumption of existing resources, and nor is it just the passive consumption of emerging innovations that other people, scientists, entrepreneurs, and so on are producing elsewhere, but the poor people themselves are part of this innovation process. That is, the poor people themselves, and not just poor people, because basic income is not just for poor, it's for whole society. It's for the whole diverse range of human experiences that are out there. But basic income is not just this kind of passive sense of, oh, you have money now, you can buy these things, or you can just sit at home and order from Volt and Amazon all these nice things that are being produced, although you can do those things, but it's also being part of the innovation process in several ways. For one, poor people engage their freedom to make choices, and those choices matter for how social evolution is shaped up. So if poor people make choices, for example, in the consumption towards, let's say, towards vegan diet, shall we say, then a vegan diet becomes more widely spread, and the innovation of veganism as either as a broad ideology or as a narrow sort of dietary choice gets selected for. Now, here it doesn't matter whether poor people make kind of rational choices, and in fact, this whole evolutionary approach is very averse to this kind of highly rationalistic notion of choice. It's more about people are influenced by others. They live in networks of social learning, cooperation, and mutual support, in which they oftentimes simply take up ideas that they hear, that they see, take up new modes of living that seem to them to be sort of like attractive in the air in which they breathe, in the environment in which they live. Maybe they learn from their neighbors, they learn from their parents, they learn from their friends. And in all these ways, they not only simply passively consume these things and use their freedom, therefore, to shape up their consumption patterns, but they also become part of this innovation ecosystem by becoming innovators themselves, becoming pioneers, perhaps, of new types of life, perhaps using the resources that they have, even if they don't have other sources of income. Although I think it's very important for basic income that it allows and indeed incentivizes people to also take part in formal labor markets to get other sources of income elsewhere. But even if they don't have those other sources of income, they will be able to use their resources in innovative ways that nobody can control and predict. And this is what it means to be part of the permissionless innovation framework. That is, poor people engage in permissionless innovation by simply saying no to other people's expectations and therefore contributing to the selection and diffusion of innovations. And sometimes they are the real creators. You know, many of the finest innovations in, for example, music have come out of the poorest and disadvantaged groups in society. Whether you think of hip hop, you think of blues, you think of jazz, you think of these different wonderful innovations that have come out of people who have been very resource poor. And I think it's precisely things like that that also contribute greatly to innovation. They don't show up necessarily in GDP, but GDP is not a good measure of the innovation capacity of society. Only in one sense I am a defender of GDP, because I think GDP is a rough proxy for the ability of society to have resources available for solving general problems. In this sense, high GDP societies tend to have more resources available for solving whatever problems they may have. They are also generally tend to be more open to diverse lifestyles. Even in music, it is precisely the high GDP countries that are often more open to very diverse musical styles and so on. So all of these things are, I think, connected. We want to think about the institutional structure to be such where real freedom can be exercised and poor people can become co-innovators and co-producers of new habits, ideas, customs, goods and services, and the like. So I think it makes sense to pay special attention to the have-nots in this, because if we really take the sort of consequentialist sense that we care about welfare outcomes, it's often the innovations for the poor that have the most impact, because poor people generally tend to have the most problems, and therefore, if we have new solutions come their way, then they tend to benefit more because they have the more problems, and if they have more solutions, then they will get the most benefits from new solutions. So the crucial insight of this evolutionary perspective is that most good solutions do not yet exist. They have to be discovered. They have to be innovated into existence. No amount of reshuffling or reorganizing of the existing set of resources, the existing pool of potential solutions to human problems, is satisfactory. We should concern ourselves with making real and hopefully permanent, or at least transitory, improvements in the repertoire of available solutions, which means exploring and expanding the possibility space of available innovations through institutional investments into those kinds of institutions, those kinds of social rules, those kinds of welfare state structures that facilitate processes of bottom-up innovation. And bottom-up is the key word here, right? It's innovation that is not top-down directed, as is I tell you to do something new, but it is this new thing emerges out of the practices, the habits, the expectations, the choices, the random mutations in the within those poor, vulnerable communities, and indeed across the whole society. So So I think we should invest more than we currently do into the construction and maintenance of those institutional structures and those welfare state measures that facilitate bottom-up innovation and experimentation. And here it's not just we isolate one domain, say, let's call it science, and say, okay, we just invest more in science and then we get more innovation that way. No. First of all, even science itself is spread out through the whole society. Oftentimes there's lots of science going on that is not in the official channels. Some of it is, a lot of it is very bad. Most of it is very bad, but it's not just that you can isolate domains. Isolating domains can be good because it can formalize structures and keep them going for a long time, right? Because if you have sort of scientific practices, they can keep going for a long time. But if you only rely on those, then you lose out on a lot of the innovation, a lot of the experimentation that can go on outside of formal structures. And therefore, the main key here is to have a combination of formal structures like science, like technological R&D departments, like business structures that are organized towards the production of particular goods and services, but also these broad domains like civil society. What is civil society? Well, it's all of us interacting together, right? It's the whole cultural domain of us interacting. And therefore, the exercise of freedom in those domains is not purely formalizable. It's the whole structure of interactions and actions that go on inside that, right? So the whole society, I think, the whole social realm should be seen and analyzed as terms of this kind of a constant learning environment, this kind of a domain of perennial discovery. A social laboratory. The whole society should be seen as a social laboratory for what John Stuart Mill, for example, called experiments in living. Experiments in living being those types of habits, those types of actions that become the seeds for imitation, that becomes the seeds for the diffusion of new types of lifestyles and habits and so on. So yes, I think that my case for the evolutionary liberal case for basic income is therefore that basic income has some features that I think make it good for turning society more towards this kind of an innovative, experimental, bottom-up laboratory. Okay, just a second. So for example, here's a quote from John Stuart Mill. He says that in this age, the mere example of non-conformity, the mere refusal to bend the knee to custom is itself a service. It is a service to society, precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such as to make eccentricity a reproach. It is desirable that people should be eccentric in order to break through that tyranny. So eccentricity here could be generalized to be just the capacity to say no, the capacity to go your own way, to forge your own path. Now, not necessarily as this kind of sense of a Nietzschean Übermensch or this kind of a Millian sense of a gentleman, this kind of a aristocratic gentleman who is like stands above society and gives it examples. Hayek also speaks of the importance of the entrepreneur. And Schumpeter also uses the idea of the heroic entrepreneur as being the pioneer. But again, like I've emphasized, it's not just that. It's not just one class. Like I already mentioned, it's not just one domain like science, not just one domain like R&D in business departments, but it's nor is it one class. It's not just the rich people here or the entrepreneurs here or the sort of bohemian artists here, but it's the whole society as being this kind of a diverse laboratory where we often don't know from which class, from which domain the most important innovations come, and therefore we need to be open to their production and their diffusion through the whole social domain. So here's another quote from Mill, just because I like Mill so much. He claims that one of the reasons for the success of Europe, of course, he ignored things like colonialism and things like that, but let's leave that aside. One of the strengths, I think he's right here, has been to the remarkable diversity of character and culture. That is, individuals, classes, nations have been extremely unlike one another. They have all struck a great variety of paths, each leading to something valuable. Well, here I disagree. I don't think each of them have led to something valuable. I think many of them have, but not each. I think it's clear that many paths lead to very unvaluable things and indeed very bad things. And this is one of the key insights here, right? So we cannot control, we cannot simply expect good outcomes. But if we have a robust system, then I think we can make the general case that in the long run, for the most part, we might expect pathways to lead to successes, especially because if people can learn from mistakes, they can therefore reduce the likelihood of mistakes being repeated, whether it's scientific theories being proven erroneous, whether it's old technologies being proven ineffective. There's a reason why we don't ride around with horses anymore, right? It's not because horses are bad, it's just they're not as good for the purposes that we want as for example, cars are. And it's also the reason why we are now moving towards electric cars, because electric cars are much better at combining our need for rapid transportation with need for protecting our environment and protecting us against the existential risk of climate change. Okay, so this is why innovations are so important in all those domains. So the model that I think we should use here is that of the adaptive landscape. The adaptive landscape was coined in biology, in evolutionary biology, by Wright in 1932, and it's been used subsequently to describe any sort of evolutionary environment in which we are trying to discover better solutions, and we are trying to reach the peaks of the sort of adaptive landscape. The adaptive landscape is simply a graphical model for the sort of process of exploration that I'm talking about here. Now, if I am lucky, I will be able to share this very briefly with you here. Let's see, share screen, and okay, so let's see, I should get the yeah. So if you can see it here, I don't know why it went dark. Is it coming back? Okay. Well, it didn't work out. I'll try again. I'll try again during the Q&A, but I won't try right now to get it back. I will try and do it after I finish my formal speech. Okay. I hope I can get it working later. But it was simply a graphical illustration of this kind of a process of landscape, this kind of adaptive landscape, which has been used in this kind of evolutionary theory and complexity theory to describe what it means to try and sort of reach the peaks of the landscape and avoid the valleys. And since we all sort of we end up with in all parts of the landscape, we don't know like where the peaks are, that is where the heights of welfare, the heights of innovation lie. So we need to find those paths, we need to find those solutions, and we need to incentivize people to try out many paths, because we don't know which path will lead to those mountain peaks. So we have like, if we are trying to send out kind of expedition, you can think of it as an expedition of charting a territory. You're trying to send out people to chart out an unknown territory. And since you don't know where the pot of gold lies, you don't know where the peak of the landscape lies, you don't know where the good things lie. So you need to send out multiple search parties. And in this analogy, it is the whole society that is kind of consisting of these search parties all the time in all areas of life, trying to reach out and discover those things and then communicate those things to the rest of society. So, of course, not just benefit for themselves that they happen to reach the peaks, but then other people can follow them, imitate them, and through various means then move closer and closer the sort of average level of well-being towards those peaks by, for example, moving towards electric cars or whatever the beneficial innovation might happen to be. Another term I will finish in about 5 minutes. The other term that I think is useful here is thinking of the current UBI debate in terms of the difference between those who argue for basic income in terms of being a kind of a safety net. What is a safety net? Well, a safety net doesn't really seem to be very creative, very innovative, right? A safety net is something you fall back on. Safety nets can be very good, okay? For example, this year I happened to catch COVID. I really needed a safety net. I really needed something to fall back on. I was not really ready to be innovative when I was down with COVID. But in other times, the safety net idea, I think, hinders basic income. Basic income does have the function being kind of this kind of a support structure in which you can wait out or sit down or sort of get some safety while you sort of regain yourself or what happens, whether it's creative destruction in the economy takes away your job, well, then you need unemployment insurance, you need social insurance, and basic income can be the core of this structure of providing that. But it's not just that. I think it's very important that basic income discourse does not get hindered by this emphasis on, for example, the narrative about technological unemployment, because if people think that the main function of basic income is to provide this kind of a cushion for people while they are down, that is, while the economy around them is being automated, well, this whole vision is completely anathema to what I'm speaking, right? Not because automation as such is bad or that I don't think it's happening. I think it is happening, and I think it can be good for society. But simply, I don't think that thinking of poor people or people who are recipients of basic income as being sort of outside the productive processes is the right way to go about it. Because again, when I say productive processes, I mean there are so many ways in which people can take part in society. Maybe it's labor markets, and I think that remains much more of a possibility than many people realize, because people are so creative. People have so many different talents, so many different skills that they can put into use. But it's not just labor markets officially, it's also the other ways that I've talked about, engaging in million experiments in living. It's engaging in free speech, engaging in debate, engaging in political action, engaging in civil society engagements. In all these ways, it's not just about being a cushion, it's about being a platform for innovation. So I think UBI is not just a cushion, it's also a platform for innovation. And indeed, it is only as this platform of innovation that it derives its primary justification from the point of view of evolutionary liberalism. Basic income being a platform for freedom as innovation, that is, freedom as the capacity to produce innovations and to engage in an innovative ecosystem of learning with other people. And it is only this justification that I think first of all, has been sort of not emphasized enough in this debate, and also I think challenges some of these other conceptions of basic income that I have mentioned here, both in terms of the economic justification as simply being sort of official labor market participation, but it's more than that, but also in terms of this liberal debate around justice. I think that this focus of justice is what people are owed and what fairness requires, or questions of that are very, very important, of course. But I think the consequentialist considerations, in my view, are equally or perhaps even more important, at least in some ways. And I think the comprehensive case for basic income must take this side of basic income very seriously indeed. So a couple of, I think, consequences of this framework is that, first of all, it sort of allows us to rethink the lazy surfer debate between John Rawls and Van Parijs, because we don't know if the surfers are engaging in socially productive activities simply by looking at what they're doing at the moment, okay? Maybe what the society needed was just precisely a group of people engaging in innovations in surfing, right? Maybe we don't know that, so we need more experiments in living, and just because some people happen to engage in these things, there's no reason to think that would be necessarily bad. It might be very good indeed. Another consequence, just to finish off here, is that I think basic income needs to be combined with anti-paternalistic policies in other areas as well. I think it's not enough to simply say, oh, you get basic income, you don't have to do anything for it. But also there has to be anti-paternalism and a wide latitude for freedom in other areas of the regulatory state. Give people real freedom, social and economic freedom in other areas, so that when they have that basic income, they can then take part in these broader frameworks of innovation and adaptation. Markets, open markets, technological experimentation, cultural experimentation. So need a wide range of social and cultural freedom, which means that basic income needs to be combined with a broader right to innovate, the right to engage in permissionless innovation granted to all people, including the poor. And the final thing I want to highlight here is that I think basic income needs to be thought of as part of this sort of foundational institutional structure of the society. It's not a public policy in the sense of, oh, it's just one of the many sort of interventions that people make. No. We're not talking of interventions here. We're talking of a fundamental restructuring of the basic rules of social interaction, okay? So if basic income is to be justified, and of course there are many downsides and dangers to it that I haven't had time to mention here, but if it is justified, it needs to be thought of and implemented as part of this broad, perhaps constitutional framework or the basic institutional framework, part of this kind of adaptive governance framework in which people are granted long-term possibilities for experimentation and innovation, long-term sustainability, long-term capacity to innovate. So therefore, as part of this broader innovation strategy, as part of this broader innovation ecosystem, as part of this kind of evolutionary adaptive governance, I think basic income has one of its justifications, maybe one of its best justifications. And I will stop there. So thank you very much.
Otto, thank you very much for this elaborate talk on your concept of freedom, innovation, and how is it related to basic income. And now I would like to ask Professor Neumaker to join the discussion. You have 10 minutes for your comment, and then Otto, you can directly react to what Neumaker just had said.
Okay, thank you very much. I try to do my best. First of all, I would like to share the screen. Do you see that? I guess so.
Yes.
Okay. When I wrote the abstract, when I read the abstract, I thought, okay, Otto goes mainstream now. Fortunately, he didn't. Yeah. A fascinating contribution, Otto. With many things, I really sympathize. With some other things, I do not sympathize so much. I hope I can show it. So my first thoughts to pose questions and requests is, you said it with the paternalistic view, and I also work against the paternalistic view of today's, which I call paternalistic capitalism. For innovations and startup, you usually need capital. So my very simple question would be, what level, or at least what kind of unconditional basic income do you need as a substitute for capital? Here you didn't say, I think, work on it, or I didn't understood it because you were very fast, yes? Second, what I know from, because you took care about poverty, is in the developing world, and we had a master thesis on this, which passed successfully only 2 weeks. There is, for example, a role concerning with substituting neoclassical capital borrowing, namely by microfinance. And it seems not to be clear if microfinance might be a better substitute for, so to speak, poor innovators, poor in the sense of poverty, not in the sense of ideas. So, would you like to couple basic income with a microfinance, or do you think one is preferable? Clearly, microfinance is based completely on ideas of design and not of evolutionary thinking. Then what I also found interesting, you had in your abstract the term cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is usually based on some monetary values or on some kind of welfare. I think you should have this in your mind, because you have the argument of consequentialism, I will come to it later, or at least on transaction costs. So what kind of measurement do you have with respect to that? You see, with transaction costs, I put my emphasis on the concept of information scarcity, because you said individuals have, under different situations, different information scarcity. Is it because many consequentialist utilitarians, for example, Harshani and Moulin, believe that only that kind of consequentialism is possible, that you have some kind of statistical uncertainty? If yes, then you can crowd out evolution as a useful approach. Or is it, that would be my approach, more nearby persons like Williamson and others, is it on unforeseen contingencies? This seems to be the argument, yes, very often in the transaction cost theory, just like Williamson, North, and many others. And do you believe for that the planning towards ex post governance, or do you still believe in evolutionary necessary? Because on what you did not say a word, and what might be very dangerous for basic income, is that we inspect very often. Gintis, for example, did that together with Bowles, that we can inspect the survival of bad mutants, yeah, which were developed in trial and error planning, so to speak. And bad mutants leave you, that's point 5, to a very ugly path dependence. So should we believe in evolutionary development when bad mutants could occur, or should we try to plan successfully against the rise of bad mutants? How this works is what I do not know, because I'm not an evolutionarist. The last question on that: act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism? When you start with utilitarianism and you said it's the art of action and all the other thing is evolution who is doing that, then you could believe only in act utilitarianism. That's what Harsanyi called the day-to-day life. And he planned on what he called rule utilitarianism. Does that play a role in your utilitarian approach? Or is rule utilitarianism, which is very nearby by Buchanan, Rawls, and many others, think about a discussion between Harsanyi and Rawls, also a situation which you have in your mind when you say, I'm a utilitarian in terms of evolutionary consequences. So what I found very interesting is to move into freedom, your freedom or my liberty arguments. Liberty, as I said it, I simply put it into my set, and then you can say if it is old-fashioned or not. For me, liberty is an individual right, individual autonomy as liberties have to exist for any kind of liberty, and we need autonomous citizens. And therefore, the definition of liberty, which is based on the professor in law, political economics, as well as political sciences, Robert Cooter, which I really like, is individual who possess a liberty is neither obligated or forbidden to do the act. Yeah, that's what you know. No justice arguments are necessary here. So therefore, I welcome your inspection, because I also think one should separate liberty from justice. Yeah, and nevertheless, what you also reported, justice arguments in the background, like the arguments of Van Parijs and also Rawls, are very useful. Other people are forbidden to interfere with the liberties exercise. You see a very conservative thing, and therefore liberty would be a protected permission. Yeah, and this protected permission would lead to self-determination as protected permission. So how is that related to your permissionless innovation? Because I would say if basic income supports self-determination as protected permission, then permissionless innovation is based on basic income as a permission. Yeah? So that would be my question on this. One has to protect and secure then self-determination and liberty in some sense. So the next thing which I found is very interesting is what Cooter then did, and I tried to do it also. He said we can start cost-benefit analysis, at least in some terms of economic thinking, yeah, only when we have some comparative static consequentialism. This means when we know how to trade off liberty with that, what you said, this broad definition of wealth. Yeah, this can be innovative wealth. I feel very good to be innovative and so on and so forth. Then you transform your liberty in some kind of wealth. And there might be very often the trade-off between liberty and wealth. Cooter said then in the end, liberty has to be defined. And this is, I think, a little bit contradictory to you as a private good, a public good, a social welfare function, or a social trump. Yeah. So he mixed it a little bit, but what is now very nearby your argument, beside the Hayekian minimal state, is who also subscribe to that in some way, is that we see here the productive issue of liberty and freedom in itself, as well as in exchange, the trade-off. Yeah, permissionless innovation is based, as I said, on the protected permission of liberty. Permission is protected as a participatory, unconditional basic income, and the argument comes very, very easily here. The argument now is, I applied this model very, very often time. It's a comparative static model, much simpler than your arguments, but it shows many ingredients. And it shows that a libertarian kind of evolution might not solve the problem in itself. For example, here I have the libertarian trap. During the Montpellier Society, Friedman and Hayek, you may know this, Tori reported this, this guy had a lot of discussions about guaranteed minimum income and also the famous negative income tax, yeah, to close the gap of subsistence. Friedman was a very clever guy. He saw ages before others the political implementation problem would be, yeah, is basic income too expensive and will individuals become lazy? That's what all mainstream economists nowadays believe is still the topic. And he said, for that, I have to impose a poverty gap. Yeah, with my kind of basic income, we cannot close the poverty gap because we need an incentive for individuals to be innovative. Yeah, to produce their wealth. Therefore, you see here where the libertarian trap is, to moving out of poverty, I have to give them, even with my negative income tax, some kind of incentive to move out of poverty to the level of what I would call the participatory basic income. And if you are at that stage, then you can become innovative, perhaps with some additional capital or whatever. In addition to basic income, you may have had an inheritance to transfer it into wealth. Yeah, unfortunately, the libertarian trap can move to a no liberty dictatorship trap. That's my oxymoron. If you start too low with the basic income, therefore you see the level is very important, then you move into the authoritarian trap. And that's what we call priceless liberty. Yeah, you would pay any price for liberty, yeah, because you need, as Rawls said, that's very important, basic liberties that you can apply liberty for transfer wealth if you are interested in more liberty. That's the called marginal liberty, because here you are free to choose more liberty to be innovative also, or more, say on the labor market, move towards more and more paid heteronomous work, and therefore organize also more wealth in monetary terms, if you wish. Now, the other thing, and I will be very short on it, is the authoritarian trap of authoritarian capitalism, not of paternalistic capitalism, that in liberty you have also the politico-economic problem, you didn't mention it, of priceless liberty. Yeah, libertarians have very often the problem that they claim for formal liberty, but it's worthless. Yeah, basic income, for example, to protect that kind of liberty is too low, and in that way you need a participatory basic income to overcome poverty. In that, I'm completely in accordance to your thinking. With the authoritarian trap, this means that's what the Chinese government is doing. More and more wealth to organize loyalty of the citizens so that the government can buy out liberty. Yeah? You need innovation, but only for stabilizing the autocratic regime. Yeah? This is another kind of innovation where the Chinese try to buy out self-determined innovation. That's, I think, also very important. And my last argument, and then I will finish it, is, and here it's very important because I highly sympathize with you, but from a static comparative point of view, from a very simple model, that participatory basic income, which solves poverty, gives any individual the option to move out of the libertarian trap, even out of the evolutionary libertarian trap of Hayek, Friedman, and many others, and also out of the authoritarian trap by moving in that direction, that they are at least here, or that they move longer towards that place where they can employ and trade off liberty against wealth in the way they like. That's very important. So I think my political economy is a little bit more enriched than yours, but it does not take into account any or many of your evolutionary, very fascinating arguments. But I believe that your evolutionary approach cannot prevent the citizens from the libertarian trap, and neither from the authoritarian trap, when you do not discuss the level of the participatory unconditional basic income, which overcomes poverty, where you said, really, that's very important. But I think the libertarians need a basic income below poverty to give incentives, not to become lazy. So the argument here is, how is the trade-off between the laziness argument and your innovative argument? Yes, because Friedman would say, I have organized with libertarian logic, as well as Hayek in some more evolutionary arguments, the laziness argument, and you add to it the innovative argument. But I think both are important, and one should try to find out an argument between the laziness argument, which may lead to the libertarian trap, or you say more opportunistic innovative argument, which might be misused towards the libertarian trap. Okay, that would be my argument. Thank you.
Okay, Otto, you can react directly. I keep track of the time, so we are still waiting for Karl's comments. So, and we have also one question from YouTube. So, Otto, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll try and keep it brief because I'm looking forward to hearing what Karl and others have to say as well. But thanks so much, Bernie, for those wonderful comments. Now, in order of not taking too much time, I will simply take the final point about avoiding the traps as something I will need to do more thinking about. I think it raises some very good questions, especially the issue of authoritarian governance in relation to these things is something I, of course, did not even touch. And a lot of these arguments that I make do not require sort of, like there's no direct requirement of strong sort of democracy, except democracy in the minimal sense of an open society where ideas and so on can be spread. Even though I personally favored, of course, democracy, it wasn't part of my arguments. It's something I should incorporate more directly, I think, in the future. But I want to touch on a couple of the things that you mentioned in your first couple of slides, because I think they're very important. So, so you mentioned the survival of bad mutants, and of course, this is one of the things that's very important here, is that if we do have real freedom in the sense combined with people not being completely in sync, that is, there's not everybody's thinking alike, doing the same things, which could happen. It's just very, very unlikely in a free society, but it could happen. People are doing the same things, in which case there wouldn't be any positive or negative innovations. But generally you have divergence, you have diversity, and this leads to mutations, and some of those are bad, some of those are good. So bad mutants, well, first of all, I think you have to accept that some bad mutations will occur. The question is how much is tolerable. And so then there's the question of the tolerable level of bad mutations, or tolerable level of kind of waste, and you could also call it. And so every evolutionary process is both messy and costly. So you have to deal with a lot of waste, you have to deal with a lot of costly outcomes. And in order to avoid those, I think you need a combination of risk management strategies. And so therefore, I think that basic income has those two functions. On the one hand, being a cushion, which is more about those kind of managing ordinary risks, unemployment, disease, like ordinary disease, not like those catastrophic pandemics, right? But like ordinary disease risks. And for those, you can develop this kind of like ordinary risk management strategies. But I think what the evolutionary perspective highlights is the importance of catastrophic risks and catastrophic consequences, the possibility of things like global pandemics that bring the whole system to a halt, things like climate change, which threatens to undermine the whole ecosystem and society in which we live. But also positive disruptions, things like the internet that really fully shapes, perhaps for the better, at least we can hope for the better, whole society, and opens up new avenues for flourishing. So I think we should focus more on those kind of catastrophic risks, and therefore also increase our investment into the prevention of catastrophic risks. And in this case, permissionless innovation does not mean the right to engage in innovations that in the aggregate produce a high likelihood of outcomes that are catastrophic for a whole society, because that would be counterproductive. It would be an example of what Popper calls the paradox of tolerance. You need to be able to tolerate things, but only those things that do not threaten the whole structure of tolerance, the whole structure of a free society. And regarding the question of rule utilitarianism, yes, indeed, I think rule utilitarianism is kind of the level of analysis which I think we need to be operating here. We need to be focusing on the rules, not because actually utilitarianism is not fundamentally, I think, the right approach. And in fact, I think that actual utilitarianism has it right that what matters are those kind of marginal, local, small-scale acts and the consequences that they have. But on the level of political economy, it is not those acts that we should regulate, at least for the most part. The reason is that, again, it is this open society which produces better consequences. It is this focus on these large-scale patterns of action that really is useful. Like a lot of scientific errors are produced by the scientific process, but if you try and prevent those scientific errors from occurring, or if you try to intervene into particular scientific theories and ban them or promote others like in a sort of coercive way, what might happen is that you end up destroying the whole process of scientific discovery. In the same way, if you try and make those kind of sort of paternalistic interventions into acts which would be good for people, you have to be really, really careful, because those interventions can destroy the whole structure of a free society and therefore in the long run be counterproductive. So in this sense, I am a rule utilitarian or rule consequentialist, because I think rules are the ones that have the highest chance of producing those long-term good consequences. And those are the ones that I think we should be focusing on, even if we are actually utilitarians in some more fundamental sense. So I leave that question open. I guess the final thing I want to say before I give it to Karl is that regarding accounting, well, two things. First of all, the capital structure. I think you cannot simply replace capital markets or banking and all these sectors with basic income. And I think you need to have also those other sources of funding available. You need to have good capital markets. You need to have perhaps microfinancing, other sorts of instruments available, that people who have basic income can have other sources of funding for maybe their entrepreneurial projects or their ideas, their experimental ideas. So I think in those sense, those kinds of institutions can coexist. And of course, there are many things I could say about the banking sector, but how it should be reformed, but I won't do that here. And the final thing I want to say is regarding cost-benefit analysis. Of course, cost-benefit analysis is simply applied utilitarian theory, and any welfare consequentialist theory like mine has to engage in it. And I think here too, like I said earlier, we should focus on the cost-benefit analysis of the rules of the institutional rules of society, and therefore have our analysis on that level of comparison. That is, we say, okay, what kind of a set of rules should we have that might have expected consequences? And then the question of how do we measure that? Well, there are different ways of measuring welfare consequences. I mean, there are different kind of quantitative measurements of fitness, of adaptive fitness, and of welfare enhancement. You can use those adaptive landscape models that I unsuccessfully tried to show earlier, in which case you can measure sort of you can set up different scenarios, and you can see in these simplified models whether people end up on the higher peaks and therefore of the levels of higher welfare, or if they end up in the lower valleys of the map. But of course, doing this, I think, always requires simplification, and therefore we need to be really looking on this long term. And I think we don't have good quantitative models for many of these processes. Even entrepreneurship, like, how do we measure the real welfare impact of the Facebook, for example? We cannot just look at, for example, the stock value. I mean, maybe it tells us something. And of course, we can create all kinds of models, but I think it gets hard. So I'm not a modeler, so also a formal modeler. So also for that reason, I think I will leave that job to others. I think there are models available in evolutionary economics, but I think those should be combined with these more neoclassical refined models, because I think those also have great utility, and combining those models might be very productive. But I think some of these things, especially in the cultural realm, I already said that entrepreneurship might be hard to model, but think about cultural entrepreneurship, cultural experimentation. We don't have good formal models, and I doubt they can be easily produced for measuring like million experiments in living and their welfare impact. We need to make some intuitive judgments. We need to make this kind of historical analysis and say, okay, what kind of things have happened? Have they been good or bad? And we have to use some fuzzy logic there to really analyze it, I think. But thanks so much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Karl, before you jump in, I want to raise the question from the YouTube audience. And it goes like this. It's from Toby K, and I quote now: "Is it reasonable to expect all people to be innovative enough to adapt to the technological progression? After all, the technology from 30 years ago is nothing compared to the technology of today. And UBI is mainly for the poor, who are more unlikely to adapt to the technological change, right?"
Okay, that's a very good question indeed. Yes, I think, first of all, empirically, the questioner is right that technology of 30 years ago in many areas has been supplanted. Although I will say, some things like how we build our kitchens, how we build our bathrooms, and how we talk to each other, they haven't changed that much in some areas. Even our airplanes are pretty similar to how they were, although much safer, I think, than even 30 years ago. But yes, I think adaptation. First of all, I think it's a comparative question. Again, speaking of comparative analysis, it's a question of, do the existing welfare state structures provide sufficient adaptive capacities to poor people, and in what ways do they fall short? And I think one of the ways is precisely that they are based on this idea of there being this kind of like political analysis of problems, and then a political solution that comes up as the problem gets politically analyzed. And it's often very laggy process, and it's very centralized oftentimes. So you have like, emergency basic income is a good example of this, right? Where I think, even though it's called emergency basic income, it doesn't fit into my understanding of basic income. I think basic income has to be permanent. It has to be a long-term institutional solution. Emergency sort of measures, interventions can have their role, but they cannot provide that adaptation. So why we want to have permanent structure of these rules, permanent structure of basic income in place or something similar, is precisely because we don't know what kind of problems arise. And therefore, we have some level of not only a cushion for safety, but also a platform for adaptation and innovation. And those two things come out only from this permanent structure. But in terms of poor people having oftentimes more difficulty adapting, I don't know if that's true. I think, well, first of all, I don't think basic income is primarily or only for poor people. I think it plays a very, very important role for large sectors of the society, including the middle class, including students, including little entrepreneurs, a lot of different categories of people. And perhaps the impact on those people in some ways might be even more important than that to poor people, although I think poor people's problems should be prioritized for other reasons. But in terms of adaptation, I think if you look at, for example, how rapidly mobile phones have spread among the very poorest parts of the world, including, for example, much of Africa and poorest parts of Asia, you can see that poor people are often very eager to adopt new technologies if they are readily available and if they have the means of acquiring them. I mean, mobile phone penetration of some of these countries I think, 80%, 90%, even among the poorest sectors of societies in many of these places, which has required the production of affordable mobile phones, the raising of the living standards of these people enough so they can afford it, and also their sort of innovative desire to imitate others and to be part of these networks of internet and others. They often use their mobile phones for internet. That's one of the important parts of it. So I think they can be very important. They are often very adaptive if they are given the resource to do so. But I'm looking forward to hearing from Karl next, I suppose.
Exactly. So I foresee that we are over time, but Karl, please go ahead, and I think we will be 10 minutes over the time we've planned, but let's see.
Okay, thanks. I think I might be legally obliged to correct that you said that I was from the University of Qatar, which is not correct. I'm from Georgetown University in Qatar. Now, this paper, I do think it's interesting that we're turning freedom around the way we usually talk about. We usually think about freedom as a basic value, and then talk about what things give you freedom, and those are good things because they give you more freedom. Now we're looking at, well, if you give people more freedom, what good things are going to come from that? Sort of turning the idea around. However, I think all this talk about, I am actually, I think, maybe more favorable to your paper than Bernie was, because I don't think it requires a more clarification about what kind of freedom you're talking about and stuff, because the freedom talk is really in the middle, and I don't think it's that important to this paper. Now, if this paper is part of a larger book that's all about freedom and this is about one good aspect of it, then maybe not. But really, it's just about a consequence of basic income. Basic income enables more permissionless innovation, and that leads to good consequences, such as more innovation. And you don't need now, freedom is involved in some of the mechanisms there, but you don't need to talk a whole lot about freedom or what kind of freedom you're talking about. Really, we're just trying to get from basic income to this good consequence. Now, so what I want to talk about is in how many levels this works. That basic income leads to more innovation. I'm reminded of something I read about how the way Little League hockey, children's hockey in Canada is organized leads to an enormous bias of who professional hockey players are, because they arbitrarily cut everything off at January 1st. I don't know if they're still doing this, but they were for a long time. January 1st, everybody who's born after January 1st is in the older grade. Everybody who's born before January 1st is in the younger grade, which means people born in January, February, and March are bigger than everybody else in their grade, because kids are growing rapidly at this time. They get more playing time. They're a little bit better next year. Then next year, they're still bigger than everybody else, and they get more playing time. And pretty soon, even though the people, by the time they're in their teens, are kind of catching up, and a few months doesn't make a lot of difference, the difference then comes from the amount of playing time that the students are getting from. This is an enormous bias in Canadian professional hockey players, that a huge number of them are born in the first few months of the year. And what this means is that we are wasting talent from this tiny little arbitrary little thing that doesn't affect class differences and all these other things. Now, if you can get a big difference like that, a huge waste of talent from this tiny little thing, how does Little League hockey account for how old people are? You get these enormous differences. Think about all the ways the kind of thing that Otto was talking about here is affecting people. Now, this one person asked a question about, isn't this just for poor people? Well, it's not just for poor people. It starts out with poor people. Let's start off from your birth, about permissionless innovation, all the things we do that hamper permissionless innovation. It starts out before you are born. Before you are born, your mother needs permission from an employer or some other authority to buy enough food and to get enough prenatal care to make you as healthy as you could be when you are born. And you find that very poor women, even in wealthy countries, especially a country like the United States is wealthy but very unequal, you find very poor women have lower birth weight babies and a lot of ill health among kids because they don't have permission to feed themselves well while they are pregnant. Then once you're born, you get worse access to health care, you get worse nutrition, and you get more neglect because sometimes the mother or the father or the custodian of the child has to work 2 and 3 jobs just to make a little bit of money and is more likely to neglect the child. And so you get children with these growing disadvantages. Then they get to school very often because they don't have, the parents do not have permission to get good housing for them. They end up becoming ghettoized, and the kids go to ghettoized schools. And they fall behind because they're being fed less well, because they're being housed less well, because they're in a ghettoized school, and because these things all lead to ill health. So you have kids falling farther and farther behind as they go. And all of this is complications of poverty. In that sense, this person is right when talking about poverty. You get people enormously behind. They're less able to innovate, and it's been shown that growing up in poverty makes you less intelligent when you grow up. It takes points off of your IQ. But then you get to adulthood. You get adulthood, you've got this group with an enormous disadvantage to begin with. And you got these other people who grew up middle class. They might have grown up as healthy as the rich. Well, good for them, all these kids that grew up middle class. But they reach a point where they get out of school and their parents aren't taking care of this. This might be when they're 18 if their parents don't have a lot of money and they can't get a scholarship. And you got to get a pretty good scholarship. If your parents have no money to contribute and you want to go to college, you got to get a really good scholarship. You've got to cover everything, your living expenses, everything, and the poor kids, but also the middle class kids. Maybe a lot of them can go to college. They get out of college. All these kids getting out of college, entering adulthood, and you come up with a problem that Thomas Paine talked about in the 1790s, is that we all start out needing somebody else's permission to use all the resources of the earth, both to keep ourselves alive and to build our own career. And as some motivational speaker once said, we spend so much time trying to make a living that we have no time left over to plan our lives. So the middle class, the middle class and the poor, anyone who is not wealthy enough to be a trust fund baby, is in this position where I've got to keep myself alive. How can I innovate when I need an employer's permission to do just about anything? I got to think, can I get some kind of job? And that's what I faced this when I graduated from the University of Michigan as a 22-year-old, graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in economics. I had to get a job. My first job out of undergraduate was a night dishwasher at Denny's restaurant, a big chain of diners. So I worked from Tennessee. Then I got into pizza delivering, and then got some other crap jobs. And that was my first year, a couple of years out of school. And enormous numbers of people, even from very privileged backgrounds, are in this position. And you can't innovate when you are worried about where your next meal is coming from. And this means if the National Hockey Association is wasting 2/3 or 3/4 of its talent, of its potential talent pool, just from doing this little thing, imagine the talent pool that we're wasting. And if you look at the big innovators, you find the vast majority of them are going to be people like Elon Musk who come from enormously privileged backgrounds, and people whose parents, say, owned a diamond mine or something like that, like Elon Musk's parents. So we are wasting our talent of everyone who can't afford a trust fund because we won't provide a basic income to make sure that we get everybody's basic needs taken care of. So I think, yeah, this is what you're saying here, Otto. I think this is really important, connecting innovation in this. We need a world. We need if you got a country of 100 million people, you need a country where you got 100 million potential innovators, not a country where you've got 1 million innovators, because only that many people have that much privilege, the privilege that they will be able to become innovators.
Shall I respond?
Over to you. Over and out.
Thanks so much, Karl. Yeah, I'm glad you resonated, and I'm glad you found those examples that I would not have thought of myself, like the Little League. I think and you also brought it back to the questions of justice and fairness, which I think is perfectly necessary and required here, because indeed a lot of it is, like, we have expectations. A lot of the debate about, for example, helping the poor in the past centuries has been heavily dependent upon assumptions, often very classist and often racist and misogynistic assumptions about the capacities of different groups of people. And we have only come to realize after centuries of learning, and some people have been, of course, more prescient about these matters than others, that for example, the capacity of people to take part in democratic participation, the capacity of people to be entrepreneurs, to be full members of the labor market, but also full members of cultural exchange and civil society. Like, we have only come to realize that we can have real diversity of people, not just in this sort of sense of all classes involved, all races involved, all genders involved, but also just all individual kind of quirks involved, right? And we can learn from all parts of the society and indeed all individuals, and it is often these quirks that really matter. That, it's one of the things about this, of course, that is partially troubling. Is that when these, when you have evolutionary systems, you often have kind of emergent inequalities. So even if you start from a very sort of fair starting point, which might be sort of the requirement of justice according to some theories, you might end up with large-scale inequalities because, for example, if there's even small differences in productivity, for example, even small differences in capacity to innovate, which might be, let's say, randomly distributed, will mean that some people will be just much luckier, for example, in where they end up, or more productive, and this will lead to some people being much well off than others. Of course, in my personal estimation, this is not such a big problem if indeed everybody's basic needs are taken care of, but it is something to consider that, for example, the famous Pareto law, that 80-20, which states that in a lot of these systems you encounter that it's the 20% of people who, let's say, make 80% of the money, and sometimes more than that, 20% of people who write the books that 80% of the people read, and so a lot of times you end up with these inequalities, and therefore you have to decide how do you deal with these issues, even if you start from a very fair, even if you say have minimized those kind of background conditions which are so important. But the point is that I think we need to combine these perspectives, and we need to input our different notions of fairness. But I think important thing here is that I think some toleration of bad outcomes will have to come with this. If we try to eliminate all inequalities, or too much inequalities, or if we try to eliminate all fairness, all unfairness, then we might end up with certain restrictions on innovation capacity as well. So we need to sort of balance out these different perspectives. I think Karl wanted to make a comment.
Yes, follow up on a couple of things. When I talked about all these mechanisms through which the kind of thing you're talking about is going to work, these are just the ones I thought of off the top of my head while you were talking. There's probably a whole bunch of more of these mechanisms that are hampering hampering innovation because everybody needs permission to keep themselves alive. And this connects me to what, so there's probably a lot more. That's something to put like just thought in. And it's a thing that's hard to research, but it is something you can, you have to think about what other mechanisms might there be. But this also returns these thought of these mechanisms returns me to that other guy's question. Isn't it just about the poor? Well, it's actually about everybody who would be poor if they weren't doing the thing they do to get permission. We think of somebody with a $90,000 a year job as being very far from being poor, but actually this person is getting well paid, but they still are in that same position where they need someone else's permission in order to keep themselves alive. They got to keep working or they're going to run out of money. And the vast majority of us are in this position. And most of us are in this position, and what basic income does, it gives us not only capital, but time, not to mention health that I mentioned before. We lack both of these things. We're hampered from being innovative because we have no capital and no time. The amount of innovation you might get by freeing people up to have those things is just potentially enormous.
Let me just briefly respond to that. I think there's also a question from the chat that I want to hear. But I think it's very, very important what you say. I think, for example, in the current debate about the productivity or the negative impacts on productivity of basic income, where we look at, for example, well, will we get a small upward shift or downward shift in employment statistics, again, does not necessarily correlate with long-term innovation capacity of society. I mean, of course, labor markets can be very good at proxies for some kind of productivity, but a lot of it also happens, first of all, outside of official labor markets, and also like you put it, the lack of real permissionless innovation capacity that people have who really are dependent on their employers or the state, and who have to make choices that fit into the mold that their employers or the state wants them to do, are in fact often prevented from being innovative. And this is, even if we, for example, see that basic income slightly reduces the involvement of people in official labor markets, at least in the short run, what might happen is that might actually increase the innovation capacity of society if it does actually give people that time and capital, and I guess time can also be seen as a form of capital, in really discovering those things in which they can best contribute to society. So I think that's why measuring real productivity in this sense is very, very difficult indeed. Thanks so much, Karl.
Karl has to leave soon, and we thank you, Karl, for being here and for your contribution and your comment. And now Fabienne wants to ask a question.
Yeah, just very quickly. So Otto, you spoke, thank you for your talk first. It's very interesting. And you spoke a lot about the chances of innovation and how it connects to UBI. So now I have like a question relating back to a talk you gave 2 weeks ago, where I spoke about the paradox of the future with all its uncertainties and all like its dystopian potential and its utopian potential. So I'd like to know how you would connect the chances of innovation to the paradox of the future.
Great. Oh yes, yeah, thanks for asking the easy question here. Well, I think there's a couple of things to note here. First of all, any evolutionary process is fundamentally uncontrollable and unpredictable in a complex system like the economy and society we have. So we can set targets, but we will likely miss the target, and we might even find out that the original target was the wrong target. Okay, so of course, this doesn't mean that we have nothing we can do. We can often guide processes. We can, for example, change the incentive infrastructure of society so that if we have all these different innovations going on, we can direct them in ways, for example, that are more productive towards the common good, that are more in line with our sustainability goals, for example, by things like carbon taxes or whatever. And otherwise, we can therefore, because the innovation is always going on within the rule structure that is in place, and if we have the right rule structure in place, we can direct the majority of innovations to be socially productive. But of course, there are many things we cannot control, for example, social media, and we are still finding ways of dealing with the reality that all kinds of awful, nightmarish, diabolical, almost Lovecraftian demons can arise out of the social media. So I think we cannot overcome the paradox of the future because any liberal system produces these divergences and these chaotic processes. But we can therefore, I think, focus on setting up the general outlines, and therefore hopefully we can guide it more where we want, setting up some goals for society, either long-term general goals like increasing happiness, or like small-scale goals like not destroying the earth, and in this second issue of not destroying the earth also brings back to the issue of crisis management. And I think we need to be spending more money in terms of dealing with these big crises, these big risks, whether it's artificial intelligence, global warming, asteroid impact, whatever it might be, and therefore to be prepared for those. I think that will be at least one way in which we can guide the evolutionary process away from some seemingly humanity destroying outcomes. But unfortunately, Lady Luck plays the final role.
So can I ask a follow-up? So if you say there are ways to guide it, how would that affect freedom? Because you also mentioned freedom.
Yes.
Sorry, it's like a very big question. Just interested in your thoughts there.
Well, first of all, I think any system of freedom it makes no sense without some self-limitations. That is, if you purely anarchist society in which everybody can do exactly what they want to do will be self-defeating, because there will be people who will subjugate each other into coercion, into submission, into bondage and enslavement. So in a purely free society, you will actually produce enslavement, because if you don't outlaw and forbid and control people who try to enslave others, then you don't have a really free society. So you need coercion against those kind of issues, and you probably also need coercion to prevent those kind of catastrophic outcomes from happening, in which case you do need to restrict certain exercises of freedom, and certain innovations might have to be made dependent on permission. In other words, for some issues, even though for most issues, I believe we have good reasons to think we can rely on the default assumption of permissionless innovation. That is to say, the default assumption should be, yes, you can innovate, and then maybe you can ask for forgiveness later. But for some other areas, I think we do need some requirements. Maybe you need to be a nuclear scientist before you can start a nuclear reactor. Like, I don't know, things like that. So I think those are the ways in which we would guide it, and we would still live in a very free society. And indeed, if you think about the maximal amount of freedom, I think a maximal amount of freedom is somewhere between pure anarchy and a heavily controlled society, where you have the right amount of coercion to prevent those catastrophic scenarios from happening, and from people from abusing their freedom to enslave or dominate or bully others.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience here in Zoom? We have no questions from YouTube here. So last chance. All right. Otto, was the discussion fruitful for you?
Yes, very much so. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I think it's one of my tasks today, I think, was precisely to open up these topics, because like Karl said, I think it's a very, very sort of rich topic which has only barely been started, and I hope that I have contributed a little bit to making people think more about these questions, to think about the relationship between freedom, innovation, and social rules, and think about, well, is this exactly one of the reasons we want basic income? Does it also pose these problems that if we have too much innovation or the wrong kind of innovation, then we might be leading towards really bad outcomes? All these issues need so much more research and so much more thinking, not just, again, academic research, because what I wanted to emphasize is that it's, again, we're all part of this. Also, this discussion about innovation is itself kind of a self-referential kind of a appeal to the open society, that we need the open society also to think about its own potential and think about the potential of innovation and freedom. And we need to engage everybody, the public, including the poor people. Like lots of poor people, I think, can contribute to this conversation, to think about what it is exactly that they want, what it is exactly that they expect basic income to do for them. And all these things are still much in the air. I think much more needs to be said, but I think I've said enough.
In that sense, Otto, you make me think. Thank you so much for your contribution, and also Bernhard Neumerker for your comment, and also again Karl Widerquist, who already left, and all the others who participated today. Check the FRIBIS website for other events and news, and now we want to end the session. I say goodbye and wish you a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.